400 arrests, weeks, not months. FBI and ICE just raided a Somali-linked mansion tied to trafficking. Tonight, we reveal where the billions came from.
As something much bigger, much darker, and potentially much more dangerous than anyone expected. Federal agents stormed a Los Angeles mansion tied to a Somali-linked trafficking network, and authorities say the money behind it runs into the billions. That alone would be a major national headline. But here's what makes this story different. At the exact same time, ICE Operation Metro Surge has arrested more than 400 criminal illegal aliens in just weeks. Gang members, predators, and violent offenders who officials say were walking free. Not because the federal government didn't know who they were, but because local sanctuary-style policies made it harder to remove them. And if you think this is just another political argument about immigration, stay with me. Because the operation that was supposed to remove the worst of the worst may have exposed a fraud empire so massive that investigators are now circling one question that stops people cold. $1 billion. That's the number being whispered in connection with Minnesota's fraud environment. And now federal sources are raising the possibility that some of those stolen taxpayer dollars may have traveled overseas to Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked terror group operating in Somalia. If that sounds unreal, that's exactly why people are watching this story so closely. Because if even part of that trail is real, this isn't only about immigration enforcement. It becomes about whether American communities were left vulnerable on the streets, and whether American taxpayer money may have been weaponized abroad. Homeland Security's message has been blunt. They say they are targeting criminals with outstanding deportation orders. Not people with paperwork issues. Not people who just missed a court date. They're saying convicted offenders, violent criminals, repeat predators, and individuals who, on paper, already had final orders to leave. And that's where the first uncomfortable question lands. If the orders were already final, why did it take a massive surge operation to execute them? Why were so many of these people still living in the same neighborhoods for years? According to federal enforcement advocates, the answer is sanctuary politics, a system that, in their view, prioritizes shielding illegal aliens over cooperating with federal law enforcement. A revolving door where deportation orders become just another piece of paper, real enough to cite in press conference, but somehow not real enough to enforce consistently in real life. Operation Metro Surge launched in the Twin Cities on December 1st, 2025, with one clear mission: remove the most dangerous criminal illegal aliens from American streets. ICE says the operation deployed more than 100 specialized officers from across the country, specifically targeting roughly 500 individuals with outstanding deportation orders. Within the first 2 weeks alone, federal agents say they arrested more than 400 people with serious criminal records. 400 in weeks. And that number matters not just because it's big, but because it's being used to make an even bigger point. These were not hidden individuals living off-grid. These were people federal officials describe as known offenders, people with deportation orders and criminal histories, who were able to remain in American communities because local cooperation was limited, delayed, discouraged, or blocked. This is where the story starts to get personal for viewers. Because it's not abstract anymore. It's not policy. It's public safety. It's the idea that the system that's supposed to protect ordinary people was bent so far that violent offenders could stay in place, sometimes for years, while the public was told everything was under control. And to show what they mean, the narrative highlights individual cases, examples designed to make the broader argument feel undeniable. Take Abdul Qadir Sharif Abdi, described as a criminal illegal alien from Somalia with alleged gang ties. The framing says he had convictions involving fraud, receiving stolen property, possession of stolen vehicles, and vehicle theft. And here's the point federal enforcement advocates hammer. With that kind of record, why was he still walking the streets of Minneapolis? Why wasn't a final deportation order treated like a final deportation order? Then there's Sahal Osman Shahadain, another Somali national described as convicted of criminal sexual conduct with a minor between the ages of 13 and 15. This is where the emotional pressure ramps up because this isn't about politics anymore. It's about the kind of crime that makes parents look at the world differently. The narrative says he served his time, got released, and instead of being deported like any sane system would demand, he was allowed to stay in Minnesota, where critics argue he could potentially create more victims. That's the kind of claim that changes the air in the room. Because people don't hear that and think maybe. People hear that and think, why was the system designed to take that risk? Other names and records are cited too. assault, robbery, larceny, domestic violence, DUI convictions, probation violations, case after case, meant to create a picture of what officials call predators and violent thugs living under a protective political umbrella. But one case is presented as the clearest symbol of just how broken this system was. Vanilau Kiyomi is described as having lived in Minneapolis since 2009 with a final deportation order hanging over his head. He was convicted of assaults in Columbus, Ohio, sentenced to 7 years in prison, serve his time, and then, according to the narrative, he wasn't put on a plane back to his home country. He was released back into American communities where he lived for years with that deportation order sitting. They're ignored while politicians argued, and the public lived with the consequences. Think about what that means in practical terms. A final deportation order is supposed to be the end of the process. It's supposed to mean the debate is over. Yet this story is built around one claim. In sanctuary environments, the process never truly ends. It just loops. And each loop is another chance for another victim. Now, even if you stop the story right there, it would already be explosive. 400 arrests, violent offenders, years of ignored orders, and a political war between federal enforcement and local leadership. But the operation didn't just become a crime story. It became a money story. And not just any money story. Federal investigators reportedly discovered that Minnesota had become the epicenter of what's described as one of the largest welfare fraud environments in American history, estimates approaching $1 billion in stolen taxpayer money. And now federal sources confirm, according to the narrative, that millions of those stolen dollars may have ended up in the hands of Al-Shabaab. That's the pivot. That's the twist. That's the moment where the story becomes something else entirely. Because if taxpayers were defrauded at that scale, and if even a fraction of those funds moved into terror-linked networks, then the argument isn't just that sanctuary politics protected criminals. The argument becomes that the entire system was exploited, benefits, oversight, enforcement gaps, and the people paying the price were ordinary Americans. One of the most emotionally charged examples cited is the Feeding Our Future Child nutrition fraud scheme, described as stealing over $300 million that was supposed to feed hungry children. That's why this case hits so hard. The money wasn't supposed to go to the government. It was supposed to go to kids. And the narrative drives the outrage with a simple moral punch. Money meant for children went into the pockets of criminals. As of late 2025, the story cites 78 people charged in this scheme, with 57 already convicted. One defendant, Abdid Mohammed Noor, is described as being sentenced to 10 years in prison. And then there are specific details included to make the fraud feel real and modern. More than $1.4 million in fraudulent Medicaid claims and more than $150,000 in cryptocurrency purchases. Not just cash, not just checks, digital assets that can move fast and disappear. Then the narrative widens. Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Services program, designed to help vulnerable people find housing, paid out $32 million over just 4.5 years, despite being budgeted for only $12 million. Federal authorities terminated payments to 77 providers over what they called credible allegations of fraud. And the program was finally shut down in August 2025, after, critics argue, the damage had already been done. Another example cited. In December 2025, federal agents raided Ultimate Home Health Services in Bloomington after allegations it billed $1.1 million for autism services while doing almost nothing for the children enrolled. This is how the story builds its central atmosphere. Not one scam, not one bad actor, but a wider environment where oversight failed, fraud scaled, and the public kept paying. So, how does the narrative explain Minnesota becoming ground zero for both a sanctuary conflict and massive fraud? It points directly at leadership, Governor Tim Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, and Attorney General Keith Ellison. The argument is that they built a system that valued protecting illegal aliens over protecting Americans. Walz is cited as signing legislation in 2023 that made illegal aliens eligible for state-sponsored health care, gave them Minnesota driver's licenses, and provided them with free college tuition. The story says he created an Office of New Americans to help illegal immigrants and refugees integrate into the United States, and expanded Minnesota Care to include people in the country illegally. Then comes the legal pressure point. In February 2025, Ellison is cited as issuing a formal legal opinion stating that holding an illegal alien pursuant to an IC detainer request would constitute an unreasonable seizure under constitutional protections. And the practical effect, according to this narrative, was chilling. It sent a message to every law enforcement agency: cooperate with IC and you could get sued. Minneapolis also has a separation ordinance described as published in June 2025, which explicitly prohibits police officers from initiating stops, detentions, or arrests solely based on administrative IC warrants. The story frames it as a city literally banning its own police from helping federal agents arrest criminals with deportation orders. This is why, according to the narrative, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit in September 2025 against the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and specific officials, accusing them of maintaining sanctuary policies that interfere with federal immigration enforcement and put dangerous criminals back on American streets. And here comes the line that's meant to stick: we elected these people to keep us safe. Instead, they protected criminals and called us racist when we complained. That's not leadership. That's betrayal. When Republicans in Congress called Walz to testify about Minnesota's sanctuary policies in June 2025, he claimed Minnesota is not a sanctuary state. The narrative calls it a lie of omission, arguing that you don't need a bill-titled sanctuary state to create sanctuary conditions. You can do it with benefits, directives, ordinances, and legal intimidation that makes cooperation too risky. And then, as Operation Metro Surge continued through December 2025, the story says something unprecedented started happening. ICE agents faced increasingly violent resistance from protesters and activists who tried to physically prevent arrests. Audio released by the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office captured an IC supervisor calling for help, describing dozens of agitators outnumbering a small number of officers. Deputies and Minneapolis police responded, but reports claimed they did not witness attacks and mainly helped agents leave because the crowd was blocking them. One activist coordinator is described as openly admitting her group was training people to interfere with federal law enforcement, claiming signups surged dramatically. And then comes the cultural gut punch the narrative wants you to feel. Everyday people, restaurant owners, neighbors, teachers, nurses, signing up for training to obstruct federal agents trying to arrest convicted offenders. That's the kind of detail that flips the story from politics into identity and social conflict. It's saying the country is upside down, that people who should be protecting communities are standing in the way of enforcement. Meanwhile, ICE reported assaults against their agents increased by approximately 1,153%, agents facing more than 11 times the assaults during operations than before. And officials specifically called on sanctuary politicians, agitators, and the media to turn the temperature down and stop calling for violence and resistance. And that brings us to the closing claim. Operation Metro Surge proves what conservatives have been saying for years. Sanctuary policies make communities more dangerous. When you refuse to enforce immigration law, criminals learn they can operate with impunity. They learn the system has soft spots. And when criminals find soft spots, they don't stop, they scale. In this narrative, the Trump administration is finally putting Americans first, and Minnesota's criminal networks are learning that the free ride is over. Officials say this administration has focused on identifying removal aliens that pose public safety and national security threats, and they point to the early numbers as proof of impact. Now it's your turn. Do you believe Minnesota's leadership created sanctuary conditions, even if they deny being a sanctuary state? And should federal law override local barriers when public safety is on the line? If you live in Minnesota, I especially want to hear from you. What have you actually seen on the ground, and do you feel safer or less safe because of these policies? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe for more FBI file-style breakdowns of stories the mainstream media won't connect up by dot, because if investigators keep pulling this thread, this billion-dollar question may only be the beginning.